What happens when the new kid at school is pushed too far? Can one quiet move change everything? Jackson Mercer, a 16-year-old from Memphis, takes a stand when he's targeted by the school's star athlete. But when a simple act of self-defense turns into a battle of power and influence, will Jackson lose it all? Watch as the truth unfolds. Don't forget to like and subscribe to H2 Black Thread for more. Jackson Carter stood in front of Harlan High School, his heart pounding as he gazed up at the imposing brick building. It was a far cry from what he was used to back in Memphis. The school in his old hometown was full of energy, life, and creativity, with murals painted on the walls and the sounds of students beatboxing in the stairwells. It was a place where individuality thrived and everyone had a voice. But Harlan High, it felt different. The building looked pristine and controlled, its windows reflecting the perfectly manicured surroundings. The atmosphere inside was cold, almost sterile. There were no bursts of color or art in the halls, no music filling the air. Instead, everything was orderly, with long, quiet hallways and an undercurrent of tension in the air. Jackson had expected a fresh start when his family decided to move to this small town. His mother had said it was for a better life, a way to leave the distractions of Memphis behind. His father, always more pragmatic, had called it a necessary change, believing Jackson needed to get away from trouble. Jackson wasn't sure what to call it yet, but as he stood at the entrance, he couldn't shake the feeling that this move wasn't about a fresh start. It was about fitting into a system that didn't seem to want him. Walking through the doors of the school, Jackson immediately felt the weight of the stairs. It wasn't overt, not like the blatant glances you'd expect from curious students. These were subtle, calculated glances, as if everyone was measuring him. He noticed it in the way some students looked him up and down before quickly looking away, in the murmurs that stopped when he entered the room. It was as though they were trying to figure him out, decide who he was and whether or not he belonged. Jackson had always been aware of how people viewed him, especially as a black teenager in a new environment. But he wasn't the type to let it bother him. Back in Memphis, his father had taught him that silence was strength, that the opinions of others didn't matter as long as you knew who you were. And Jackson knew exactly who he was. He wasn't going to let anyone's whispers or sideways glances make him feel small. But it still stung, the feeling of being watched, the sense that people were trying to figure out how he fit into their world. As he made his way through the hallways, Jackson could feel the eyes on him, some more obvious than others. He was no stranger to being the new kid, but this was different. This place felt colder, more isolating. He wasn't just the new kid, he was an outsider in every sense of the word. The front office was only a short walk away, but with every step, Jackson felt the heaviness of being an outsider grow. As he passed groups of students, he could hear their low conversations stopping as soon as he got close. He could feel their eyes on him, their curiosity almost palpable. But he didn't stop. He didn't give them the satisfaction of reacting. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Strength isn't about showing off, it's about knowing when to walk away. And so, Jackson walked past them, his back straight, his face expressionless, letting their whispers fade behind him. Inside the front office, the receptionist greeted him with an overly friendly smile. She handed him a folder with his schedule and asked if he needed help finding his first class. Her politeness felt hollow, as if it was all just a formality. Jackson nodded and thanked her, but he didn't let himself linger. He didn't need help. He didn't need anyone's pity. He had already been through enough new schools to know how to navigate a place like this. As he left the office, he passed a group of students near the lockers. A tall, broad-shouldered guy with perfectly styled blonde hair leaned against the lockers, flanked by two friends who were laughing at something he had said. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it was meant to be overheard. just loud enough that it was clear they were laughing at someone, at Jackson. Ryan Callow, according to the roster, looked him up and down before offering a casual smirk. It was the kind of smirk that spoke volumes, a smirk that said, "I see you. And I'm not sure I want you here." Jackson didn't flinch. He didn't even look back at Ryan. He had been through this before, being sized up, being looked at like he didn't belong. But he wasn't going to give Ryan or anyone else the satisfaction of a reaction. Jackson kept walking, his head held high. He wasn't going to give anyone the chance to think they could push him around. Not here, not now. As he passed Ryan and his friends, he felt their eyes still on him. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but he ignored it. He wasn't here to make friends. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to survive. The bell rang, signaling the start of the day. Jackson took a deep breath and walked to his first class, pushing the weight of the stairs out of his mind. The halls were still eerily quiet, the sound of footsteps the only noise as students filed into their classrooms. Jackson walked with purpose, not rushing, not hesitating. He was in control of himself, and as long as he stayed in control, nothing else mattered. By the time he made it to his first class, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He had survived the first wave. He had made it through the halls, through the whispers, through the stairs. And now he just had to make it through the rest of the day. Jackson sat at the back of the classroom, his mind already drifting. The teacher was talking, but he wasn't really listening. His thoughts were too consumed by the people around him, by the way they had looked at him, by the way he could already tell this was going to be a long year. But he wasn't scared. No matter what happened, no matter what they threw at him, Jackson was ready. He wasn't going to be broken. Harlan High might be different from Memphis, but Jackson wasn't going to let it change who he was. He wasn't going to let them make him feel small. He had a quiet confidence, and as long as he held on to that, nothing else would matter. The second day at Harlan High felt like the first day all over again. Jackson Carter navigated the hallways with the same quiet resolve, ignoring the whispers that seemed to follow him like a shadow. His goal was simple: get through the day without attracting unnecessary attention. He kept his head down, moving from one class to the next, doing exactly what he had promised himself, keeping a low profile. But sometimes, life had other plans. It started with the football team. Austin Thompson, the golden boy of Harlan High, was someone Jackson had already noticed, even if he hadn't yet met the guy face to face. The captain of the school's football team, Austin, was a local legend. He had that classic, movie star charm, the chiseled jawline, the confident smile, and the swagger that accompanied every step he took. Austin's popularity was obvious. He walked the halls like he owned them, surrounded by a loyal entourage of teammates and hangers-on. His reputation preceded him, and it didn't take long for Jackson to realize that in a place like Harlan, Austin was the king of the school. At first, Austin barely acknowledged Jackson, which was fine by him. Jackson wasn't interested in being noticed by anyone, especially not someone like Austin. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that Austin was sizing him up. It wasn't blatant. There were no obvious stares or gestures, but Jackson had grown up in Memphis, and he could read people's intentions just by the way they looked at him. It was subtle, a shift in body language, a glance that lingered just a little too long. As the days passed, Jackson started to notice Austin more and more. Every time their paths crossed in the hallways or in class, Austin seemed to be watching him from the corner of his eye, his smirk never far from his lips. It wasn't the kind of smile that was friendly or curious. It was the kind of smile that suggested Austin knew something Jackson didn't, that he was deciding whether or not he wanted to make Jackson his next target. Jackson tried to ignore it, to keep to himself, But that wasn't enough for someone like Austin. The first real incident came in the cafeteria. Jackson had just found a quiet corner, settled down with his lunch tray, and was doing his best to stay out of the spotlight. The cafeteria was buzzing with conversation, the sound of trays scraping across tables, and the occasional burst of laughter. Jackson had already learned to tune it all out, to create a mental bubble where he could just eat in peace. But then, the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps broke his concentration. He glanced up just in time to see Austin and two of his friends, Kyle and Trevor, approaching his table, their footsteps synchronized as if this were some sort of parade. Austin was at the front, a grin on his face, his eyes fixed directly on Jackson. "Hey, Mercer, you mind if we join you?" Austin asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. The question itself wasn't offensive, but the way it was said, too casual, too forced, immediately put Jackson on edge. Austin didn't want to sit with him. He was looking for something else. Jackson looked up at him, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm good, thanks," he replied flatly, hoping the hint would be enough. Austin, however, didn't take the hint. "What's the matter, man?" He continued, leaning in a little closer than necessary. "I thought the new kid was supposed to be friendly. Or maybe you're just too busy with that neighborhood of yours, huh?" Jackson felt the words hit like a slap, but he didn't react. He just kept his gaze steady, forcing himself not to show any sign of discomfort. He knew what Austin was doing. He was testing him, trying to provoke him into a reaction. Austin's two friends snickered, and Jackson could see the glint of amusement in their eyes. The laughter was quiet, but the message was clear. They were waiting for Jackson to crack. They were waiting for him to react. Jackson wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. "Don't know what you're talking about," Jackson said evenly, his voice calm. He didn't look away. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got lunch to eat." Austin's grin faltered for just a second, and Jackson saw a flash of irritation in his eyes. He could tell Austin didn't like being ignored, but Jackson wasn't about to engage. He knew better than to give in to someone like Austin. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You don't need to fight every battle. The best way to win is sometimes to walk away." Austin wasn't done, though. He was playing a different game. With a sudden, exaggerated motion, he swiped Jackson's apple off his tray, sending it flying across the cafeteria. The apple landed with a dull thud near the drink station, and for a moment, there was a silence. The students nearby looked up, watching the scene unfold. Jackson took a deep breath, his jaw tightening, but he didn't let the anger flare up. Austin smirked. "You gonna do something about it, Mercer? Or is that what you do, just sit there and take it?" The comment wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough that the people around them could hear it. A few heads turned, curiosity dancing in their eyes. They were all waiting to see how Jackson would respond. Jackson set his fork down slowly, his eyes never leaving Austin. The cafeteria had fallen quiet, and for a brief moment it felt like all eyes were on him. But he didn't rush. He didn't act out of anger. His movements were deliberate, controlled. He stood up, his posture straight. He didn't show any sign of fear, any sign of weakness. "I don't know what you're trying to prove," Jackson said, his voice low and steady, "but I'm not your target." Austin's smirk never wavered, but there was a slight hesitation in his stance. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Jackson to stand his ground without losing control. Jackson didn't back down. He simply stepped around Austin, walking toward the drink station to retrieve his apple. Without saying another word, he returned to his seat. The silence in the cafeteria lingered for a moment before conversation slowly resumed, as if nothing had happened. But Jackson could feel the tension hanging in the air. This wasn't over. Austin wasn't going to let it slide. He had underestimated Jackson, and Jackson knew that now. The taunting wasn't over, not by a long shot. But Jackson had made his point. He wasn't the type to be pushed around. The following days at Harlan High felt like a never-ending series of small confrontations. Every time Jackson walked through the hallways, he could feel the weight of Austin's stares, the constant undercurrent of tension in the air. Austin's attempts to provoke him had become more frequent, more pointed, but Jackson had remained calm, keeping his composure. Each time Austin pushed, Jackson pulled back. He didn't let himself rise to the bait, didn't let Austin see the anger brewing just beneath the surface. But everyone had their breaking point, and Jackson's was coming. It started during lunch. Jackson had found his usual spot in the far corner of the cafeteria, just far enough from the main cluster of students to stay out of sight, but close enough that he could observe the rhythm of the room. He wasn't hiding, he just didn't feel like being part of the spectacle. As he unpacked his lunch tray, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching, followed by laughter. His stomach tightened instinctively. Austin and his two friends, Kyle and Trevor, were making their way over to his table again. This time, there was no pretending, no subtlety. Austin's grin was wide, almost too wide, like a wolf sizing up his prey. The group of three swaggered toward Jackson, and as they got closer, Jackson could feel the temperature in the room rise. He didn't need to look up to know they were coming for him. He could hear the shift in the atmosphere, the way people around them seemed to go quiet, as if they knew something was about to happen. "Well, Austin said, his voice dripping with mockery. He planted himself in front of Jackson's table, blocking Jackson's view of the rest of the cafeteria. His eyes were narrowed, scanning Jackson's face. "I thought you were going to be the quiet type, Mercer, but here you are, just sitting by yourself like some kind of outsider." Jackson didn't flinch. He knew where this was going. He had seen this play out before. Austin was going to test him again, try to get a reaction out of him. He had to hold his ground. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Let them speak, Jackson. Let them try. Your strength is in your control." "Just here to eat," Jackson replied, his voice steady, not looking up. He wasn't going to give Austin the satisfaction of making eye contact. It was clear that Austin wanted a reaction, wanted to see him flinch, to see if he could break him. But Jackson wasn't going to give him that. But Austin wasn't having it. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to make sure only Jackson could hear. "You know, I've been thinking about it," he said, eyes flicking toward his friends who were already smirking. "You don't really belong here, do you, Mercer? I mean, how could you? A kid like you in a place like this. Doesn't add up." Jackson kept his eyes on his lunch, trying to ignore the spike of irritation bubbling up inside him. He didn't have to take this. He didn't want to take this, but he wasn't about to give Austin the power of getting under his skin. "Just let me eat," Jackson said again, his voice low but firm. He could feel the tension thickening, could hear the low chuckles from Austin's friends, but he stayed in control. This time he would walk away with his dignity intact. But Austin wasn't done. He wasn't going to back off that easily. In one sudden move, Austin shoved Jackson's shoulder with a force that made Jackson's tray wobble. It wasn't a bump. This was a shove, intended to provoke. To make Jackson flinch, to make him react. And Jackson felt it. His jaw tightened, the pulse in his neck started to beat a little faster. But he stayed still. The cafeteria went silent. Everyone who had been talking just moments before was now watching, the tension in the air palpable. The silence that fell over the room wasn't just from the sudden interruption. It was from the anticipation, the sense that something was about to happen. Austin was watching, grinning, waiting. Jackson could see it in his eyes. He wanted him to fight back. He wanted to see Jackson lose control, wanted to see him angry, to see him vulnerable. But Jackson wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He wasn't going to give Austin the satisfaction of seeing him lose his cool. Instead of lashing out, Jackson did something that no one expected. He moved. In one fluid motion, Jackson stood up, his movements smooth and controlled. His calmness was in stark contrast to the chaos in his head, but it wasn't anger he was feeling. It was the calmness of someone who had been trained, someone who knew how to handle themselves, no matter the situation. His movements were precise, methodical. Austin didn't see it coming. With a sudden twist of his wrist, Jackson grabbed Austin's arm, twisting it effortlessly into a lock, then using his own momentum to pivot and send Austin crashing to the floor. It was so quick, so controlled, that for a moment there was no sound in the cafeteria. It was as if the entire room had collectively taken a breath, holding it in as they processed what had just happened. Austin hit the floor with a loud thud, his eyes wide in shock. His friends froze, unable to react. For a second, the cafeteria was dead silent. The world seemed to pause, and all eyes were on Jackson as he stood there, his chest rising and falling slowly, the calmness in his demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos that had just unfolded. Jackson didn't smile, didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply turned and sat back down at his table as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just made the cafeteria fall into stunned silence. He picked up his fork again, pushing his food around on his tray as though it were just another day. He didn't need to look back to know that everyone was watching, everyone was talking. But Jackson had made his point. Austin scrambled to get up, his face flushed with a mix of humiliation and rage. He glanced at his friends, who looked just as shocked as he was, unsure of what to do next. He could feel the eyes of the entire cafeteria on him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the one in charge, the one who made others bow to his will. But in that moment, he had been the one brought to the ground. The murmurs started immediately, like a ripple in a pond that quickly turned into a wave. The students whispered, pointing to Jackson and then to Austin. Someone had filmed it, and the video would be passed around in minutes. By the time the bell rang, everyone at Harlan High would know what had happened, and it would change everything. Jackson hadn't fought with anger. He hadn't fought with violence. He had fought with control. And now, everyone would know that Austin Thompson wasn't untouchable. The lunch bell had barely rung before the news spread like wildfire through Harlan High. Jackson didn't know who filmed it or who had started the whispers, but it didn't matter. Within minutes, the entire cafeteria was buzzing with the story of what had happened, of how the new kid, Jackson Mercer, had taken down Austin Thompson with one swift move, humiliating the football team's star player in front of the entire school. At first, the whispers were tentative, cautious. People were unsure how to process the situation. But then, as the story continued to spread, something shifted. Some students looked at Jackson with new respect, nodding at him in the hallways, giving him approving looks. They weren't used to seeing someone stand up to Austin Thompson. And even though the confrontation had been physical, Jackson's calm, controlled response had impressed them. He wasn't some hothead who had let his temper take over. He had shown them something different, something that they hadn't expected. Others, however, didn't see it that way. For them, Jackson had become a spectacle, a source of entertainment. They gathered in groups, talking about how the new kid had taken down the king of the school. They exaggerated the story, making it bigger than it had been, turning it into a narrative that was more about the fight than the reasons behind it. "Did you see the way he dropped Austin?" one student said, shaking his head in awe. "That was like something out of a movie." "You don't just mess with someone like Austin and get away with it," another student replied, her voice low. He's gonna come after that kid. No way he lets it slide. Jackson didn't care about the rumors or the exaggerations. He wasn't in this for the recognition or the attention. But even he couldn't ignore the looks, the way people now saw him as something bigger than he was, as if the one moment had defined him. It wasn't about being the new kid anymore. It was about being the guy who beat Austin Thompson. But Austin Thompson wasn't just going to let it slide. Jackson didn't see Austin again for the rest of the day. After the incident in the cafeteria, Austin had disappeared, his usual confidence replaced by a simmering rage. Jackson had expected that. He knew people like Austin didn't handle defeat well, especially not public defeat. The kind of humiliation Jackson had just delivered wasn't something Austin could just shake off. He had to do something about it. That evening, as Jackson was walking home from school, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting to see a message from one of his few friends, maybe Lily, who had been one of the few students to offer him a genuine word of encouragement. Instead, it was a message from an unknown number. "You think you're tough. You got lucky today. Don't think this is over." Jackson stared at the screen, his stomach tightening. The message wasn't surprising, but it made something shift in him. He had expected Austin to react, but seeing the words in black and white made the reality of the situation set in. Austin wasn't just going to walk away. He was going to escalate this. And when someone like Austin wanted revenge, the stakes were always higher than a simple schoolyard fight. The next day, Jackson noticed the tension in the air the moment he stepped into the school. The atmosphere felt charged, like the calm before a storm. He kept his head down, moving through the hallways, trying to avoid drawing attention. But it was hard to ignore the sudden shift in the way people were looking at him. Some students whispered as he passed, and others outright stared. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he had the unsettling feeling that he was no longer just a new kid in a strange place. He was now a target. By lunchtime, Jackson learned exactly why. Austin had mobilized his influence. Jackson wasn't just dealing with an angry football player anymore. He was dealing with a boy who had connections. Austin's father, an influential member of the school board, had begun pulling strings to make sure that the incident didn't just fade into history. He had set his sights on Jackson, and now Jackson was facing a challenge that went beyond the physical confrontation of the previous day. Jackson was about to be in serious trouble. The first hint that things were about to escalate came when Jackson was summoned to the principal's office during lunch. He had been sitting alone, lost in thought, when a teacher came up to him, telling him to go immediately. There was no explanation, no reason given. Jackson knew deep down that it wasn't a coincidence. He walked to the office with a feeling of dread settling in his stomach, the weight of what was happening hitting him with every step. As he entered the principal's office, he saw not only Principal Harris sitting at his desk, but also two school board members, including one man Jackson recognized, Austin Thompson's father. The man's cold gaze immediately locked onto Jackson's. "Jackson," Principal Harris said, his voice tense, "we need to discuss yesterday's incident." Jackson stood tall, his arms folded across his chest. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice steady, though inside he could feel his pulse quicken. "You know exactly what it's about," Austin's father snapped, leaning forward in his chair. "My son was humiliated in front of the entire school, and now I have to clean up the mess you've made." Jackson's heart sank. This wasn't going to be a conversation about fairness. This was about Austin's pride and his father's influence. Jackson could already feel the power dynamics shifting against him. "You're being accused of assault," Principal Harris continued. "Your actions in the cafeteria yesterday were excessive, and they've caused a disturbance throughout the entire school." Jackson opened his mouth to respond, but Austin's father raised a hand to silence him. "I don't care about your excuses, boy," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You will pay for what you did to my son." The principal shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly caught in the middle. Jackson could see that Principal Harris didn't want to get involved in this, but he was going to be forced to choose sides. And the side he would choose would not be Jackson's. "Listen, I wasn't looking for a fight," Jackson said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I just defended myself. Austin started it." The man across from him, Austin's father, scoffed. "You think I'm going to let you walk away from this, just like that? You'll be lucky if you're not expelled for what you did." Jackson knew this was only the beginning. Austin had made sure that his father's influence would ensure that Jackson's life at Harlan High became a living hell. What had started as a physical confrontation was now something far more dangerous, and the stakes were higher than ever. The following days after the meeting with Principal Harris were filled with tension. Jackson could feel the weight of the accusation hanging over him like a dark cloud. Austin Thompson's father had made it clear he was going to use his influence to ensure that Jackson paid for what had happened in the cafeteria. Every moment Jackson walked the halls, he felt the eyes of students on him, some filled with pity, others filled with judgment. But despite everything, Jackson refused to be intimidated. He wasn't about to let Austin and his father's power dictate his fate. Jackson knew the truth. He had acted in self-defense. But in a school like Harlan High, where power and status ruled everything, the truth didn't always matter. What mattered was who had the most influence. And right now, Austin had the upper hand, but Jackson wasn't about to let it slide. He needed to prove the truth, to show that Austin wasn't invincible, that no one, not even the football team's star player, was above the rules. That's when Lily Carter stepped in. Lily had been one of the few people who had supported Jackson from the beginning. She had seen him stand up to Austin, had seen the way he kept his cool in a situation that would have made most people lash out. She admired his strength and discipline, and when she heard about the plan to expel him, she knew she couldn't let it happen. "Jackson," she said one day after class, her voice low but determined, "I've got your back. I know what happened in the cafeteria, and I know it wasn't what they're making it out to be." Jackson turned to look at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Lily continued, "I saw what happened, and I'm not the only one. A lot of people saw it, and we can prove it." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "How?" Lily smiled. "I've got footage of the whole thing. Someone in the cafeteria recorded it. Plus, there are students who were right there who can back you up. We can take all of it to the principal. We can show him the truth." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't known anyone had recorded the incident. It was a game changer. If they had video footage, it would be impossible for Austin or his father to spin the story into something it wasn't. But Jackson wasn't one to trust easily. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice wary. "What if it makes things worse?" Lily shook her head, her expression firm. "We've got nothing to lose, Jackson. This isn't just about the fight. It's about standing up for what's right. And if anyone should be expelled, it's Austin. He's the one who started it all." Jackson nodded slowly, realizing that she was right. It wasn't just about proving his own innocence. It was about sending a message. He wasn't going to let Austin or his father get away with using their influence to bully people. The next few days were a whirlwind. Lily, along with a few other students who had witnessed the fight, began gathering evidence. They got a hold of the video footage from the cafeteria, where Jackson had taken down Austin in one smooth martial arts move. The footage clearly showed how Austin had shoved Jackson first, how Jackson had acted in self-defense, and how Austin had been brought to the ground without Jackson throwing a single punch. The video wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. It showed the truth, and that was all that mattered. Lily and the witnesses also gave their testimonies, each one corroborating Jackson's version of events. They spoke about how Austin had been the aggressor, how Jackson had kept his cool, how he had responded not with anger but with precision. The students who had seen the incident firsthand agreed that Jackson had done nothing wrong. On the day they were to present the evidence, Jackson walked into the principal's office with a newfound sense of resolve. He wasn't scared anymore. He wasn't going to let Austin or anyone else control the narrative. This was his story, and he was going to tell it his way. Principal Harris sat at his desk, his expression unreadable. Austin's father was there too, standing by the principal's side, his arms crossed and his gaze cold. Jackson felt a flicker of unease, but he quickly squashed it. He was here to do what was right, and he wasn't going to back down. Lily stood beside him, her face determined. "We've got evidence," she said, stepping forward. "Proof that Jackson wasn't the aggressor and that what happened in the cafeteria wasn't an attack. It was self-defense." Principal Harris looked at them both, then at the video on the screen. He said nothing at first, watching the footage in silence. Austin's father didn't say anything either, but Jackson could see the frustration building in his face as the truth unfolded before him. The video clearly showed Austin shoving Jackson, and Jackson responding with nothing more than a defensive move that sent Austin to the ground. When the video ended, Principal Harris turned to Austin's father. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "But this evidence is undeniable. We can't take any action against Jackson. This is a case of self-defense." Austin's father's face turned bright red. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He was furious, but there was nothing he could do. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no way to deny it. Jackson stood there, feeling the weight of the moment. He had done it. He had proven that he wasn't just some kid who had acted out of anger. He had shown that he was strong not because of his fists, but because of his ability to control himself, to act with purpose. Austin's father finally spoke, his voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over," he said, glaring at Jackson. "You'll regret this." But Jackson wasn't fazed. He had already won. And as Austin's father stormed out of the office, Jackson turned to Principal Harris. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice steady. Principal Harris sighed, looking at him with a mixture of respect and regret. "Austin won't be expelled, but there will be consequences. And as for you, you're free to go. There's nothing else we can do." As Jackson walked out of the office, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but he had proven something far more important than his innocence. He had shown that sometimes the truth was stronger than any influence, stronger than any amount of power. When Austin returned to school the following week, he wasn't the same. His cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by something else, something quieter, more subdued. He didn't make eye contact with Jackson anymore, and he didn't hang around with his usual crowd. His defeat wasn't just physical. It had shattered the image of invincibility he had built up over years. Jackson, on the other hand, walked through the halls with a quiet strength. He didn't need anyone's approval. He had already won, not just the fight in the cafeteria, but the bigger battle, the one that proved his integrity and his ability to stand up for what was right.